Good morning. All right, so Ron, do you have a couple of those for the musicians coming off? Thank you so much for musicians. Beautiful. Music was beautiful, and you're beautiful. No one part better than the other. So I am going to shock you guys today. My name's not Michael Huffam. I'm not the pastor here. Michael, the pastor, apparently had gotten sick last night. Maybe a stomach bug. I'm not certain. So I got a text quite early saying, "Hey, buddy, how would you like to talk today?" So I said, "Absolutely, I'd love that." But that means, since I'm not Michael Huffam, that I also am not going to speak about love, okay? So I thought, what's the best and closest thing I could get to love last minute? And I decided we're going to talk about law, all right? Pretty close, right? Just a very fine shade. Ron, I think we need one more over here for my brother Edrol. And so we're actually going to talk about justice and oppression today, and this is something that is very fascinating, at least for me, and hopefully I can convince you that it's fascinating as a thought experiment as well. And so are we ready for this? Justice, injustice, oppression, righteousness, all of these things. Are you guys ready? You look so fired up. Are you ready? Maybe you're so fired up, right? You're so excited. You're like, okay, let's go. All right, so here's the deal. I'm going to go back and I want to tell you a little bit about law, justice, and oppression. And we're going to start back all the way to the law of... Oh, by the way, let me tell you about this handout. I basically, instead of having a PowerPoint, which would have been a little more labor intensive, I put everything on this two-sided sheet of paper. And so this is a lot of the passages. They're all taken from my favorite version of the Bible, which is The Voice. You guys know this. It's scholars that basically got paired up with poets, musicians, people who knew what world language would sound nice, and they got together and created this version called The Voice. And I thought it was interesting as I've been looking at this. I put the heading up here, Lex Talionis, and this is actually Latin for this concept of eye for an eye. It really means lex is law of justice, of what's fair, what's right. And so they call this eye for an eye, kind of eye for an eye, and it should be an and. I see that typo. That's great. So this is what happens when you're working last minute. And so we're going to start way back. There's the Ten Commandments we know about, and a lot of people would say, well, the Ten Commandments were kind of just part of the Hammurabi's code, which was really a pillar. So Hammurabi was the king or the emperor or ruler of ancient Babylon, and this dude, he had a large government on his hands. It encompassed a lot of surrounding countries that he had dominated and taken over. And what he started to think is, could we do better as we devise laws? And so he sent out people throughout the kingdom to say, what are the local laws? What are the local traditions? And we want to hear about them. So he took and he compiled this long list of all these laws, and then he tried to consolidate and say, what are the things that really are coming through in all these different laws, and those will be how we govern. And we know about Hammurabi's law because we unearthed a large black pillar, and it had 282 laws written in the side of this pillar, and these are known as Hammurabi's Code. And so a lot of people will look in the Ten Commandments and they see some tie-ins with the belief system and these codes and laws from Hammurabi, and we say, see, it's just this natural borrowing, it didn't come from God, and his was, chiseled into the stone, there's all these tie-overs. I don't want to get into that this morning. What I want us to understand is what justice looked like not all of justice, but there's a certain principle and language, this eye for an eye business that's used in Hammurabi, that's used in the Old Testament teachings, and then it's used by Christ in the New Testament. And so I want to really look at the history of this idea, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and see where it takes us. So in Hammurabi's world, in his kingdom, and this is actually at the top, I wanted you to be able to go home and you can look at this for yourself. Here was his code. And of course, it's got some redactions from there, but you get the gist. If a man has destroyed the eye of a man of the gentleman class, they shall destroy his eye. If he has destroyed the eye of a commoner, he shall pay 1 mina of silver. If he has destroyed the eye of a gentleman's slave, he shall pay half the slave's price. Right? And so, what I want you to understand is it's eye for an eye unless you're a commoner or a slave. And so, justice actually is conditional. Justice is based on who you are, your rank, your caste, right? And so, there are some people that are more important than other people in Hammurabi's world. So if you're a gentleman, if you're a scholar, if you're one of the ruling class, the rich, the wealthy, the powerful, it's an eye for an eye. It's true, what they would say, justice. If, on the other hand, you were a commoner, if you were poor, if you were a foreigner, it was a different rule. In fact, actually, foreigners would not have been in this list. They would not have been covered by this law because you were a foreigner. But there was a different law of justice depending on where you were in that social pecking order, if that makes sense, right? And this was thought to be just in the ancient world, that some people were better than others. And then, here we have this Israelite nation rising, and God gives them these instructions, these laws, that are actually found in 3 different places. It's kind of, I think, a principle that's throughout many of the 5 books of Moses, but the special, big ones, Exodus 21, verses 18 to 27, I have that listed, and also Leviticus 24, 17 to 22, and finally Deuteronomy 19, 18 to 21. They use this language of eye for an eye in these 3 different passages. The reason why I put Exodus 21 first is because Exodus 21 is a very detailed account of how this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth law should actually be spelled out and how it should be lived. I'm not going to read through it. You can look it up later. But what's telling is, it's a very different world. Because in the ancient world, Israel's ancient world, they took Hammurabi's code, eye for an eye, but they went a step further. They didn't say that it was for the gentleman, there was justice for the gentleman. They said that's unjust. There's an oppressive element in these rules, in this code of conduct. And so they said this was the same for everybody. People should have equal treatment. And so it was no longer upper crust versus lower crust. Everybody was an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and it was across the board. And so in some ways it was a just law, and that feels like a giant leap forward, right? From a moral standpoint, that's a giant leap forward. And then this passage in Exodus, what's really amazing is he talks about pregnant women. We talked about women at all receiving justice, which no ancient law would ever have included women. And yet it talks about women, it talks about pregnant women. If you damage you get into a fight and you accidentally hit a woman who's carrying a child, and that child comes early, there's actual consequences for women in the Israelite code of conduct, in their ancient law, which was totally unheard of. And then if you were a slave, imagine this, there was a lot that was given to slaves if you were hurt, if you were injured. So if you lost your eye, if you even had a tooth knocked out, you automatically went free as a slave. You were given your freedom, and then you were given money on top of that to give restitution to the loss of the eye or the loss of the tooth. This would have been absolutely jaw-droppingly unbelievable to the ancient world, that everyone had access to equal rights. Right? This is something I think we often talk about as equality and equal rights. And so they said, as believers in this God of heaven, this Yahweh, the God of heaven, He wants us all to treat one another fairly. And what's even more impressive, if that's not impressive enough, we find in Leviticus 24, which is one of the verses I've listed, verse 22, I actually wrote it in here because I think this is another important point in this. He says in Leviticus 24:22, this law of equality across all ranks and different political parties and slaves and women and everything else, this law applies to everyone equally, both native-born Israelites and outsiders. I am the eternal one, your God. So this law was not just for the Israelites. He said if a stranger, if a foreigner, if an immigrant, if a refugee, anybody who's within, you're saying everybody gets treated the same. It doesn't matter because they're all children of God, right? This is so incredibly cutting edge and revolutionary. You think, man, this is a giant leap forward. And yet Christ comes and He's going to take it a step further. We're going to talk about that in a minute. He's going to play with these concepts again. And I think it's pretty incredible what He says. But I want us to sit with just this idea of equality for a minute, where everybody gets treated the same. This is so foundational to the law of God that it is talked about through the entire Old Testament and it runs into the New Testament. Over and over again, this idea of oppression and true justice is told and retold, where it gets to the point, and I want to read from just the next chapter in Exodus. So we looked at Exodus 21. We're going to skip forward to Exodus 24. In Exodus 24, he's going to talk about the same law, but he's going to talk about it from his perspective. And he's going to use similar language to what we're going to look at in the book of Matthew chapter 5. Because in Matthew he talks about an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If you take someone's cloak as collateral for a loan, you can only hold it for so long, right? And it has all this stuff in there. Well, here's where it comes from, Exodus 24, and I just want to read this because I want you to hear what the denial of true justice means to God. God is a true God of justice, and not a justice for some, but a justice for all, an equal system for all. And so when we have injustice, when we have oppression, this rankles the heart of God. And so he says here in Exodus 24, verses 21 to 27, he says this, do not wrong or oppress an outsider. An outsider. This isn't even somewhat a different caste. These are outsiders. These are foreigners. These are refugees. These are immigrants. These are somebody other than, right, than you. They don't look like you. They don't talk like you. They don't have the same traditions as you. They may not even worship God. These are people that may worship Baal or Ashtoreth or a million other things where you think they don't deserve the same access to justice as we as Israelites, true believers, true worshipers would. And yet God says, no, my law is my law. It's divine, it's universal, it's unchanging. It doesn't matter who you are, what you believe, what skin color, it's always the same, because justice is justice, truth is truth. Right? And it's an equal standard. So he says, do not wrong or oppress an outsider, which just that word has such weight to it. That's why I stopped, living among you. For there was a time when you lived as outsiders in the land of Egypt. And I think that's still true. All of us have been outsiders at some point or other. In fact, this is important. I'm going to come back to this thought in a minute. But verse 22, you must not take advantage of any widow or orphan, someone of a lower caste, someone who has less money or resources, right? Christ later in the New Testament says, if somebody, or James talks about this, he says, if two people come in and one is wealthy and one is poor, don't say to the wealthy man, you sit at the head of the table, and the poor you sit in the corner, because you right there perverted the very gospel of God, right? He says, you treat everyone as if they were in the image of God. They were children of God. And so there's a lot of this that goes throughout Scripture. But he says, don't take advantage of any widow or orphan. If you do oppress them, and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear them, and my wrath will be kindled. And I will make sure you are slaughtered by your enemy's sword, and your own wives and children will become widows and orphans. This is heavy language. God's not messing around, right? He really believes in this thing called justice and equity for everybody, even people who don't worship Him. Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, whatever it is, justice is justice. What's right is what's right. And so he continues in verse 25, if you loan money to anyone of the poor among my people, do not treat them as borrowers and act as their creditors by charging interest. Because often this was an unjust system. It was a system that was built for oppression, right? Of other people, other humans, where they would become enslaved and slaves of other people because they would put interest rates on it that was not within that person's ability to pay back, and before you know it, they lost their home and their family and they've been sold into slavery. And so he says that cannot happen among you. If your neighbor gives his coat to you as collateral, then be sure to give it back to him before night falls, even if he has not repaid you in full. You see that coat covers his body and may be his only protection against the cold. And what do you think he would sleep in? And when he calls out for me, I will hear his cry. I am a kind and compassionate as you should be when your fellow Israelite is in need. And so God says, don't mess around, because the moment there's an inequity in the system, the moment there's an oppression, the moment there is a person that's better than, he says, you need to watch your P's and Q's. Because if you mess with those people that are on the bottom, that are vulnerable, he says, you will invoke the wrath of God. And I'm not playing around here. I will, he's like, you are wiped out. He says, you're dead. You're dead. Right? Your family are going to be orphans and widows themselves. He's not playing around. This is like, taking Liam Neeson, whatever. He's just like big time, right? This is a big threat. And so, what I find interesting in all of this and what we've talked about so far is I want us to, in theory, at least in theory, let's just send this out there into the universe. Is it possible that there are systems of oppression? Is it theoretically possible to oppress other people? Yes or no? All right, so as a theory, this works, right? And so now we're just talking, right? Anybody dying right now? Because I'm going to start bringing this closer to home, and the heat's going to go up in the stove a little bit. And I just want us to just understand nothing I'm going to say is personal. I just want us to talk for 1 minute. Okay? Can we talk? Is this okay? All right. So we're going to just pretend, theoretically, that there are systems, there could be systems somewhere that are created that actually oppress others, that are unjust, that have an upper and a lower, a better and a lesser, right? Theoretically. And then let's just, as a thought experiment, do you possibly believe that way back in ancient times, when we were essentially cavemen and women, right? Equal opportunity here, and we had no knowledge of anything, that there were possibly, maybe, systems of oppression way back? Well, you would suppose that's true, because Hammurabi talks about a system where there's better and less. Moses in the law talks about a system that oppresses, right? And so we could potentially say there have been systems in the past that were oppressive, right? Are we on the same page? You're like, I see where you're going, and I'm not going to go with you. Okay? Is that what we're saying? Okay. So if we're going to agree that it's theoretically possible that there's systems that oppress, and we can all kind of collectively agree that there probably in history, way back, nothing modern, that there have been times in which there have been oppressive systems, right? Then I just want to throw this out there. I'm turning the heat up again, right? I'm going to just act. Do you think it's possible that in our modern enlightened world and day and age that we, not intentionally, But do you think just somewhere out there in the world there could be, in a country we don't know about, systems of oppression? What do you think? How many believe that? Okay. All right. And of course this doesn't involve do you believe, how about this? Now we're saying that there are or could be systems that oppress in the world today. Right? Okay. We're getting closer. Okay? We got to dial the heat up. I'm feeling a little bit. Let me get a little drink here. Okay? And we'll go. Do you think, and I want to just go on record, okay? How many of you are good human beings? Come on, it's all right to own it. It's okay. I think you're good human beings. I'm going to say I'm a good human being. I'm going to say every single one of you, as I look out, that I can see, that are within my hearing, you are good human beings. I've spoken to many of you, and I know you are good people. You're good husbands, you're good wives, you're good parents, you're good grandparents. You are good human beings, and you do a lot of good. You give your money, and you give your resources, and you do a lot of good in society, right? So I don't want this to be a reflection of you in any way, shape, or form, but I want to ask the question, just as a thought experiment, is it possible that without your knowledge, without knowing, you could be caught up in a system that actually oppresses others? Is it possible? Okay. Now, when we talk about that, and this is getting really close to home, we're going to turn up the heat a few more degrees, but I just want us to just sit there for a minute. This is that proverbial frog. And I have to do this for myself. This does not reflect on your intentions, on what you meant to do, on what you truly believe, but I think we can sometimes, without thinking, get into systems that oppress others, or better than, less than, and we don't mean to. And sometimes those systems that we have in place are actually meant for good. And I think I said this last time, and I'm going to say it again this time. It sometimes, and I don't think that this happens here, we're going to say maybe theoretically, hypothetically, right? Try to remove it as much as we can. Sometimes, I think, not this church, but I think sometimes churches, somewhere out there, right, way far away from Maine or northern New England, they can have systems of insiders and outsiders. There's the good people and the you need Jesus people. The not so good people. There's the I'm in and you're out, right? And so we have an insider language and we have insider, right? And I'm not saying that's bad necessarily. I'm just asking a question. At what level is that actually productive and good? And at what level are we potentially treating other people differently than we're treating ourselves? Right? How much of our resources, and sometimes you can say, how much of our resources are going into the community, and how much of our resources are staying here? How much of our resources are going to fight injustice and inequity in the system, and how much of our resources is staying here to ensure our higher status, our place, right? And that would never be true here, I'm sure, right? But we intentionally or unintentionally, we can fall victim to these large things, oppressive systems, and we're not doing it because we're bad people. We just do it because we're not seeing it. And my whole thing is, we have to be careful. Right? I just said, there is like a snake somewhere in this field, and you're trying to walk through the grass. You're going to watch. You're going to be careful, because you don't want to get bit, right? So you're going to really, you got a stick in front of you. You're trying to figure this out because you don't want to unintentionally oppress someone, because if you do, or if you decide on, or if you put yourself on the side of the oppressor, what happens? God is against you, and you're like, but I'm with the church, Jesus. I'm your guy, right? I'm your guy, and yet God is so mad. He's like, you're dead to me. In fact, you're just straight dead. And you're like, oh, okay, I don't want that, right? And so you're being extra careful for systems of oppression. So I was thinking, I'm trying to think of how I can bring this home this morning. And I did something that I chose an example that I have no emotional connection to because of who I am, but I am going to concede something. I'm going to concede that you're not me. Okay? Does that seem horrible? You're like, no, that's a good thing. I'm glad I'm not you. If I were you, I'd be horrible. So here's how horrible I am. All right, true confessions, okay? Safe space? Safe space? I'm not hearing anything. This doesn't sound very safe. All right, safe space. I did not watch the Super Bowl. Okay. Hey, safe space, people. All right, safe space. What is more is I'm not entirely certain who the players or teams were that were in the Super Bowl. Okay, safe space, people. I gotta keep on this. I do not follow sports. Not basketball, not baseball, not football.
Amen.
Okay, safe space. Safe space. I'm sorry, I want to care, I just don't. Okay? Safe space, people. And so, I'm trying to think of an example, and I'm thinking about, and there's something that happened a couple years ago, and I understand some people are more into this than I am. And I'm not going to say if it's good or bad, because I'm not as informed as all y'all, right? I'm not informed, and you're going to have a PhD in what I'm about to share, and you're going to be like, I've got the footnotes, I got the this, and you don't think about, and you're going to be able to put some serious pieces together. I'm sure there's going to be a whole wiki page on it, right? But that's not me. So I'm going to talk about something specific to try to illustrate potentially something that's larger, and I could be totally wrong. Is it okay for me to be wrong? Is your head going to blow up if I'm wrong? Are you going to die if I'm wrong? Can we all just agree that just for 3 minutes we can suspend anger and judgment? Is that okay? Just for 3 minutes. That's all I'm asking. Give me 3 minutes, hang myself. That's all I'm asking. Right? Then I'm going to run out of here after church. Just never come back. And I actually, to be honest, I had to look up this situation because I couldn't even remember the names. I remember there was this guy, Colin Kaepernick, right? And I knew there was some stuff, and what he said, and I know this thing blew up, and it's about the military and the U.S. and all, but what I think he was saying initially, in my deluded, uninformed way, is he said he believed that theoretically, in not all settings, not all places, he said there are some pockets where some police officers are not upholding justice for all, and that sometimes some specific individuals will oppress minorities or not treat minorities the same way as others, right? And so he started to kneel. That's what I think he started to sit, I read, and then he started kneeling during the national anthem as a quiet protest to that because he said there's a system of oppression. I think the whole world blew up. Maybe he may not even be in football anymore. I don't know, right? I didn't read that far. But here's the thing. Whether it's true or not, if somebody says there is something that's oppressive in our system and in our culture, how should we treat that? Do we just run over it? Or are we really careful because we as believers know that God is going to always side with the oppressed? Amen. Always. And you're like, well, I don't believe in God. Well, go, dude. Run through that field with, your shorts and no shoes on, right? You do you, right? But if you actually believe in God, and you believe that this isn't all made up, pie in the sky stuff, and that there is a God that's watching what we do and what we say, and if we dishonor God when he says you be mindful of those who are outsiders, who are oppressed, those who are marginalized. Anytime you see a system of injustice, that you always side with the oppressed. We, as believers, should be very, very careful, right? Because God says, I'm watching. And you're doing a lot of bad stuff. That's like, I'm gonna forgive you. I got your back, my blood covers. Then he's like, but if I hear the widow, the orphan, the oppressed, you're done. Right? Like this God of infinite love, he's like, you're done. So this should be like a huge wake-up call. And so when we look at this, I think we just have to pause, right? And I'm not saying this is the only system or the only ways we find injustice in the system. I'm just saying whenever you hear the word oppression or injustice, I'm saying just stop for a minute. I'm not saying don't throw through the filter of, does this align with my political ideology or not? Does this align with my heritage and what I was taught to believe by my parents? That may be great for many, but I want you to just pause and run this through the filter of, I don't know if there's oppression or not, but if God is going to, if he says I'm dead, if I am against the oppressed, I just want you to be mindful. That's all. Be aware. Don't stomp on any snakes, right? Because I want you to be healthy, right? If I'm acting in Michael's stead, and Michael's the good shepherd, he's a shepherd for the flock, I don't want anyone in the flock to get bit by a snake, right? That's all. So let's be mindful. We good? All right, now we're going to go back to safer ground. We're going to dial it back. Is it okay to go to safer ground? All right. I survived, at least for now. All right? I have 3 more minutes to stay alive. So now we get into this. This is this whole dialogue about justice and equity, and then Jesus ratchets it up. This isn't John, okay? This isn't me. I'm not this good. But now we get to Matthew chapter 5, and this is on the back. As I want to have this in a font size that my eyes could read, okay? I'm sure you guys could have gone smaller, not these eyes, all right? Matthew, these glasses aren't for show. This is the real deal, right? So Matthew chapter 5, and we're just going to read verses 38 to 48. You're going to see some of the same imagery and some of the same conversation, and yet Christ is doing something radical. He's switching this whole teaching on his head again, and we're going to figure out what he's doing. Are we okay? Yes. All right, here we go. So verse 38, you know that Hebrew Scripture sets the standard of justice and punishment. Take an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. We've seen that. We beat that one to death, right? But I say this, don't fight against the one who is working evil against you. You're like, what? Whoa, what? Whoa, right? If someone strikes you on the right cheek, you are to turn and offer him your left cheek. And if someone connives to get your shirt, give him your jacket as well. And if someone forces you to walk with him for a mile, walk with him 2 instead. And if someone asks you for something, give it to him. And if someone wants to borrow something from you, do not turn away. Maybe we'll just stop right there for a second. We just went through this eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, justice for all. Everyone should have equal rights to justice. And now Jesus is saying, hey, if someone takes your coat, give them your shirt as well. Right? If someone strikes you, don't strike them back. Turn to the other cheek and let them strike you again. Right? Did we just lose sight of justice? Did God, the God of fairness and equality, suddenly, what happened to that dude? Right? We start to get confused, right? Well, let me just say this. The God of justice and equality is still a God of justice and equality. I don't think his word changes. I think what he's talking about here is he's flipping the equation around. And so he's saying, you as Israelites, you are the rulers. You're setting up this kingdom, this society, and you will govern according to these laws. But now he's talking to the Israelites thousands of years later, and these Israelites are no longer masters of the universe. These Israelites are the ones that are enslaved. They're the ones oppressed. They're the ones that are being treated poorly, right? They're being overtaxed. Their land is being taken from them. Their worship centers being taken over by the Romans. They're putting in these puppet priests. And now they're the oppressed. They're not the rulers. They're the ones on the lower end. And this is the key here is he said, verse 39, but I say this, don't fight against the one who's working evil against you. So in other words, this is the powerful working against you. And how do you respond when you yourself are being oppressed? That's what this passage is about. So there's unjust systems. We don't want to be the ones that are persecuting, that are oppressing. But then what do? How do we respond when we're the ones being oppressed? And we don't just throw justice out the window. We don't say, well, it's all good now, right? God's the God of let me be oppressed. That's not what he's actually saying. He's saying if you're being oppressed, I want you to have a different mindset than that of the world, right? And so all this chapter, he talks earlier about if your eye sins, looks at a woman, well, pull it out of your head and throw it to the fire because it's better into it. And he's not being literal there. What he's saying is there's this internal, and if you think of, you may not have murdered somebody, but if you even hate someone in your heart, then you've murdered them already. That doesn't mean like, oh, I hate that person, I guess I might as well kill him, right? He's saying that there's this internal reality of his law and his commandments that's supposed to work on who we are, right? Now normally, and this is all counterintuitive, normally if someone knocks out a tooth, you're not like, hold still, player, I'm going to knock your tooth out, right? Somebody kills your cow, you're like, I'm going to kill your whole herd, right? They come back and they retaliate and they, kill off your herd plus a horse, you're going to go and you're going to burn their whole farm down. You know what I mean? Like, it's always one-upmanship. That's how this world works. And yet God says it's not even an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. He says, okay, I want you to constantly lean into, I'm going to take care of you. And what happens is, there's this weird dynamic, and we've seen this happen in history. There's this nonviolent resistance movement, right? We talked about, like Martin Luther King, he would say, we're going to resist, but we're not going to be violent. We're going to just turn the other cheek. And it's these teachings that lead to this nonviolent resistance, which amplify the evil in the system. And that amplification of evil hopefully causes some people to wake up and say, what am I doing? Who have I become? What have we become? Right? And so we saw that this worked back then, and this is the same kind of mentality that Christ is telling us to do today. And so we're going to just read the last few, we'll end it, we'll close it, we'll wrap it up. Verse 43, he says, you have been taught to love your neighbor and hate your enemy. And that makes sense, right? That's the world we live in. We love the people who love us, we hate the people who hate us. But I tell you this, love your enemies. Pray for those who torment and persecute you. In so doing, you will become children of your heavenly Father, your Father in heaven. So in other words, if you oppress people, you're dead to God. But if you side with the oppressed, if you're on the side of the oppressed, you can know that you are children of your heavenly Father, right? By either siding with them or if you are part of the oppressed. He, after all, loves each of us, good and evil, kind and cruel. He causes the sun to rise and shine on evil and good alike, those who oppress and those who are being oppressed. He causes rain and water of the fields of the righteous and the fields of the sinner. It is easy to love those who love you. Even a tax collector can love those who love him. And it is easy to greet your friends. Even outsiders do that. But you are called to something higher. Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. That doesn't mean you never sin. That means be perfect in your love. Be perfect when it comes to justice and oppression. Be perfect when it comes to your heart and your response when others treat you poorly, right? And by this we show how we are the children of God. All right? Amen. Thank you guys for your time. Oh.